Thanks, Shauna. I've got to say, out west, I've got used to people being very informal. So when I hear about the Dr. Dunne, I kind of wonder, is there a doctor in the house? Anyway, but thank you for that. This presentation is a collaboration with a wonderful designer whom you may or may not know. His name was Paolo Corre. And Paolo works for St. Elizabeth Healthcare. And we came up with this together and have worked hard on it together. And it's still a work in progress. But let me talk a little bit about the motivation. So first of all, let me hear a couple of answers. When you see this, this is like a Rorschach test. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you see that image? Workshop. Okay, excellent. That's exactly the motivation for us, because I do workshops. Paolo does workshops. I do a lot of executive teaching in our MBA program and in other programs. And the big pain point for me has been that, I teach people design, and they come away, they're business students and executives, and they come away saying, wow, that was amazing. And I say, well, what was so great? What did you learn about it? And I get answers like, well, the customer experience, the user experience journey is so cool, or I learned how to use Post-its and all that sort of stuff. And I sort of think, wow, well, isn't there more? I mean, didn't I reach deeper into your soul and heart and mind? And very often I get a blank stare, because what I want to do is to change how people think. And when Paolo and I were talking about this, we found we had exactly the same motivation, that the methods for us were kind of peripheral. It was really all about fundamentally changing people's minds and ways of thinking. That becomes more challenging than just teaching methods. As you can see here, I understand this is, unfortunately wasn't here yesterday, but I understand this is not the first iceberg you've seen in this conference. So we don't get an A for originality, but at least, hopefully it's of value. What we see at the top is the methods. So if you're leading a workshop, you're working with students or executives, you can see them practicing the methods, and you can sometimes see them switching modes. But the deeper stuff, the motivation, the mindset, and even the very worldview, that their basic assumptions about the world, all of those are hidden from us, and they're much, much, much harder to reach. For designers, one way of thinking about it is the fundamental worldview is the answer is in people. It's in people's emotions. For a lot of business people that I deal with, they will say, well, the answer is in the numbers. For an academic like myself, and I was a business person before I became an academic, it's really the answers in the literature, right? So I go to the literature if I want to find answers. And these are very, very different starting points. But why? Other than just of academic interest, why would you want to be interested in mindsets? Well, one reason is that for a lot of designers, the whole area of design has been, if you like, commoditized. And as one magazine put it, as design thinking is packaged like a happy meal. So the idea of saying, okay, design is not just about Post-its and throwing little soft Nerf balls around, but there is actually some substance here. That's an important aspect of it. A second aspect is the idea of being self-aware. And just for yourself, if you want to deepen and enhance your own design practice, that being very aware of how you think and how you approach the world is a great starting point for that. And at last year's Service Design Conference, for example, there was Futurice had presented the Intelligence Augmentation Design Toolkit, which is, again, that same kind of sentiment around the mental journey. The other thing is recognizing who might be your allies outside of design with a capital D. One of the things we heard as we were doing our research, and I'll talk in a moment about how we did it, but was the idea that designers and social workers, if you're in the healthcare field, often speak the same language. Why? Because social workers are on the ground, they're talking to users, they're hearing about people's pain, and they're really almost living people's pain. And so they see the same things as being important. And so if you know how you think, you can start to make some of those connections. And then finally, in large organizations, which have been the subject of my interest for quite some time, the whole idea of building bridges to others who maybe think differently from you. And we'll talk about some of those differences in a few moments. The big question, probably the first question that came to us is, well, okay, is there a distinct design mindset? You hear a lot about all the things that designers do and say and think, and you have to question, well, hang on a minute, other professions think in similar ways too. How much of this is really distinctive? And we found, yeah, there is. We did both a literature search and a series of expert interviews. The expert interviews were with both with academics in the field who were my connections, and also some senior designers, including people with Google and so on within the field. And so we did hear a very, very consistent pattern from it. But one of the people that I spoke to, this was actually from one of the academics, said, hey, that's the problem I have, that it being design keeps creeping out into being everything. And then I'm like, if it's everything, it's nothing. So it's a bit like the selling of design by the Tim Browns of the world and such has been very much that designers can do everything. We wanted to try and get away from that. The other part of it is try to distinguish between what designers do and what designers are and how they think. So very often when you ask people, what's the design mindset, they'll say, oh, they do user research, right? Well, that's an activity. What's the mindset behind that? And the mindset might be something like empathy, for example. So we wanted to make sure that we were talking about at the level of mindset, not the level of practice. So here are 5 things that we found very consistently across the interviews that we came up with, that we did. And they were expressed in different ways, expressed in different words, and we've tried to distill them to the extent that they make sense. One was that a designer is a humble unexpert. And here's a quote from that. In many ways, a design mindset is the unexpert mindset, because when we become experts, we default to what we know, and we no longer ask questions. So there's this kind of tension between if you like, the deep dive that you need to do to work on any project, and the higher order perspective that you need in order to be able to see the big picture. And it can be a tough road to walk. A second quality is that designers are optimistically curious, or if you like, curiously optimistic. We had a number of people who contrasted the design profession with other professions, and this one was about lawyers. Lawyers think in terms of shooting things down. They think about always, what's the reason this won't work, and that designers have such a strong yes mindset. So it's this idea, and that becomes important for some of the stuff I'm going to talk about later. It is actually fundamental to designers to be optimistic. They're translators between the abstract world and the real world. That's been one of the fun things, because as I've said, a business background, one of the fun things about working with Paolo, that Paolo is unusually ready to go to the abstract. And I don't know many business people who will do that, but equally ready to say, okay, let's make this concrete, right? And that fluidity between abstract and real is a very distinctive feature of designers. They're all about people. I mentioned earlier this idea of the starting point being, or the answer is in people's emotions. One of our interviewees said, who's most impacted by this? And then, where's their voice? Have we even talked to them? To me, that's a mindset of design, just to have always that fiercely human-centered focus on anything you're doing. I would say, if it means anything, that for the interviews that we did, this was almost the first thing that people went to every time. They always talked about human-centered. They're integrators and connectors. So the idea being that designers are out in the world. If you take famous examples like Uber, it's not like no one ever has done car sharing before. What would happen if you mixed X plus Y in this context, a cultural context, and play around with the business model and different user groups? And so this person was actually referring to and the name escapes me, but it's a system of car sharing that's existed for a long time in Israel. Another interviewee I spoke to, and I wanted to say this one because I thought the audience would like it. They said the designers are much more interesting people to talk to. And why? Because they're out there. They go to movies and they're out in the culture looking at things, and they bring those things back into a project. And then by comparison with other fields, other practices, we found that the law profession, for example, by contrast, they say we spend as much time as we need by ourselves to get it right. With business and strategy, the whole idea is about making a case, so it's becoming assertive. Here's the plan, here's why I think it's going to work, and so on. Where, by contrast to designers who are much more fluid and exploratory in what they do and how they think. The research field, of many of my colleagues, for example, the idea is to look for patterns, but to look particularly at the main effect. So, and you'll see this a lot in business. You'll see that business people are looking for what's going to sell the most. Where are the biggest numbers? Where's the average? Designers are more likely to look on the fringes at, oh, well, this individual, did this, use this interface in a particular way. If that's not typical, why is that? Why did they use that? And it sort of triggers their curiosity. So it's the idea of looking at the fringes rather than looking at the main effects. And then for engineering, the idea that there is a best answer, and in particular, that best answer is about never failing. It's about reliability and never failing. I had an engineer colleague years ago, a civil engineer, who was actually, the day that he started work, was required to sign a statement saying that he would never make a mistake, which I thought was interesting. You don't get a lot of employers like that, but some engineers. How does that actually work out in practice? Well, the central thing that we believe is happening, and it's in the middle of the slide, is that design is scary. And I'll talk to you in a moment about why that is. How is that manifested? Well, it's manifested in a couple of ways. On the left of the slide, I heard a story from one person I was talking to about this whole idea that the design team are the entertainment. If you've got a day-long workshop, external workshop, and you want to break, it's intense material, you want to break it up a bit, let's bring the designers in the lunch break, and they'll do some Post-its and Nerf balls and that kind of thing. So it's kind of like bringing the clowns, which trivializes it to some extent. On the other side, when I was interviewing for the book, the book that I published last year, Design Thinking at Work, I heard the term crazy cowboys. That's in Canadian Tire, when they started their design team, some of the people internally said, oh yeah, there are those crazy cowboys out there in the design team who are doing this. So there's a certain amount of trivialization of design that goes on. And it's worth then sort of reflecting on, how does all that arise? So we started to think, we actually got this idea from one of our interviewees, and we started to think about problems. On the one hand, you've got problems in the vertical axis there, where they can be an unknown problem or a known problem. Notice I've got known in parentheses because we often think we know the problem, but we don't really know it. And then on the solutions end, again, we could have unknown solutions and known solutions. Business people like to live up here in the top right. Okay, so they like to have problems where you've a clear understanding of what the problem is, and the solutions have been tried before, so you have a good idea of what the solutions are. That's their comfort zone. Designers' comfort zone is down here, and we've labeled it the black hole of discomfort. And you can see right away that there's, designers love working in unknown spaces where you have trouble finding out what the problem is and much less the solutions. The other two then, the valley of, if you like, false optimism, I put in there in brackets. So that's where you don't know what the problem is, but you've tried a bunch of solutions before, right? So maybe they'll work. So that's the sort of, but that's where the false optimism is, because you don't know if they're going to work unless you know what the problem is. And then in the top left, what I call the peak of possibility, the idea that, yeah, you know what the problem is and you have to now find a solution to that, known problem. So your solutions are unknown. It becomes scary when you go down this way, right? So when you go down from the business comfort zone into designer's comfort zone, and that's very threatening to your clients or to your corporate colleagues. They deal with it, however, in different ways. So very often what will happen is the starting point for a design project is actually in the top left. They'll say, oh yeah, we know what the problem is, but we don't know what the solution is, and you, designer, should come up with the solution, and by the way, make it look pretty while you're in the process. And the designer says, oh, no, wait a minute, are you sure you really know what the problem is? So they're sort of diving down into the bottom left. The established ways of dealing with this is for consulting, and there are really two paths, right? So the horizontal path is to say, okay, well, we know what the problem is. We have a method. It's, if you like, a hammer looking for a nail. This is a nail. We have a hammer. Off we go. We'll move you over to the right. We'll give you a known solution to your known problem. Or sometimes you'll give them, the company will give them an unknown problem with an unknown solution. The classic way that consultants will deal with this, and this is not my opinion alone, this is what we heard from our interviewees, is to turn the problem into a nail that they can hammer with the hammer they have. In other words, can we frame this problem in a way that suits the methods that we have? So they'll get you pretty quickly up to known problem and then across to known solution. The other way that we heard about was this idea of what we call the power model. And it's the idea that the CEO or somebody very influential has a clear idea of what this problem is and also what the solution is, and very often may make it worse. So in one of our interviews, an interviewee talked about physician burnout. And so that the CEO of the hospital had a particular idea that, okay, we can solve physician burnout with a particular process, and it turned out that that process required a bit more paperwork, and what they hadn't taken the time to find out was that it was all the paperwork that was causing the burnout. So they just made the problem worse, and the solution didn't last. Okay? So that's one of the perils, obviously, of thinking that you know the problem and that you know the answer, and it's really driven by power in the organization. By contrast, then here's what happens with designers. Okay, so in other words, and this is actually a huge simplification, you start off thinking you know the problem, you go down into the black hole of discomfort. Now you're saying, well, okay, we don't know what the problem is, wonder if we can try a solution here, and then you're going back and forward from problem to solution, and eventually, all going well, you get to some sort of agreed territory. So that then is fine. I mean, that's how designers work. But you can appreciate that if you're used to dealing in a world of certainty, how difficult that is. And so from one business person, I heard the following. These people will drive you crazy. I mean, I'm trying to work with them because they bring so much value, but it's hard for me because they're here and then they're over here, right? So the whole idea of just not knowing where you are can be very threatening for business people. Although we've heard a lot of great things about designers and how designers think, it's not all good. It's not all pretty. Okay. So one respondent told us, well, the naivety of a designer fights against the practicality of things sometimes. So they go to this idea, but they haven't really explored just how feasible it is. They don't think of the people who are actually trying to provide that interaction and that service, and it's not sustainable. And the way to think about that, again, I mean, if you think about the healthcare field, you can make all the patient experience improvements that you want, but if you don't bring the staff and you don't bring the nurses and doctors into the picture and you don't consider them to be users, you're going to get nowhere. Right? So thinking about, I'll come back to that theme, thinking about what you might call intermediate users between you and the final user is a very important part of this. They're also very protective of their identity. Paolo and I were actually speculating this morning on designers' shoes. And we believe, we have a hypothesis here that designers actually wear either very fun sneakers or Blundstones, as it happens, so I'm wearing the uniform. We'll have to see if we can prove that. However, the serious point is, and I heard this again from several people, that designers have a clear sense of their identity and who they are, or very defined sense of their identity. Even if they're not professional designers, if they're service designers who don't have a qualification, they have a very clear sense of who they are. Most business people don't. Right? So it's a very different thing that there is a sense of being a designer that doesn't exist for business people. So given the kind of tension that arises here, that people get scared to work with you, and that there's clearly a bit of, if you like, jealousy or intimidation that's expressed in different ways, how might we do this? So our basic message here is empathize, don't evangelize. As one of our interviewees said, sometimes it's like when someone just found religion and you want everybody to know. Right? So there's a little bit of that tends to go on in organizations. And specifically, it's very easy for us to dismiss the contribution that our colleagues make to things. So as one of our respondents said, in design education, designers get inculcated with this idea that they can save the world. But you're not going to save the world on your own. You're not going to save the world without the contribution of many, many other people. And it's important to keep that in mind. Connect perhaps with like-minded people. So that's our first suggestion to you. When I did some research with the Australian Tax Office for the book, I was really impressed with the whole idea that they didn't actually develop a strong central lab. All they did, not all they did, but their main effort was about building a design community, so that they had workshops every month at 7 a.m. They had a number of design conferences internally where they brought in design experts. But the idea was to create connections between people and to create a community. So that's a big part. That would be our first recommendation here. Second one, we heard over and over again, I'm trying to paraphrase this quote. I don't have it in front of me, but it was that I keep hearing this talk from designers that nobody loves us. And I really want to take them aside and say, use your tools, use your methods in order to reach out to others in the organization. And that's where this use your empathy comes from. The empathy of the end user and how would I use this thing, that same mindset can be applied to empathy towards the engineer who has to build the thing, or empathy towards the business leader who has to make all the decisions. What if, in addition to your end user research, you use similar methods to think about the needs of the engineers in your organization? Or what about the decision makers in your organization? What if you really listen to them in the way that you listen to end users? Yeah, it makes things more complicated, it makes it more constrained, but designers love constraints, right? Work with what you have, start with the familiar. This is this idea of the most advanced yet acceptable. So start where people are. In other words, as some of our interviewees said, connect with people, see what you can find that actually you can build on, and from there you can build a community, not just a community, but some empathy for what you're trying to do. Use your humility. Again, not just your empathy, but your humility. Another way that humility shows up is in deference to other disciplines. If I'm asserting as a designer, like that new technology will solve that problem, and I don't listen to the engineer or whatever that says, like we can't scale it or whatever, then I'm going to miss the chance to make something that will realistically work. So it's this idea. I have a counterexample to that, again, from some other research I was doing, where this was a design team that was working on automobile accessories. And they did a great job on the idea of consulting end users. They did workshops, and they had end users coming in and creating things and using Post-its, but all kinds of other things. They made games for them and so on. But they kept the engineers out of it. Sorry, I should correct it a little bit. They brought the engineers in for the occasional meeting in a very controlled way. What I received were transcripts of all the meetings. And so when the engineers were out of the room, they were saying things like, oh, the engineers don't know anything. They're like, they referred to them as flatlanders. And they were referring to a book, it's actually from the 18th century, a book called Flatland. And it's the idea of a one-dimensional person who's a dot and who doesn't see anything outside of his own miniature world. And so the idea that, and that was what they were, obviously arrogantly comparing engineers to. So we're saying, no. You've got to bring the people who matter into this process just as you bring end users into the process. Steal. I'm going to recommend that you steal relentlessly. So in other words, you have your design methods. You have user journeys, you have your personas, you have all of the other things that you use. Think about some of the business methods too. These are also things you should consider. That's Porter's diamond on the right for those of you who don't recognize it. And so that's, again, another starting point and another way of saying, okay, is there some interface we can find, for example, between a model like that and design methods? So that's the kind of stuff that academics are really trying to do in their classes too, which is to try and find ways you can look at things from very, very different perspectives. It's also better, as our interviewee said, when you sort of steal from some of these other methodologies. I don't think design encompasses everything. It's better when you're able to look holistically. Show, don't tell. We talked about, it was interesting, I was delighted that you came up with the term workshops when I showed the Post-its earlier on, because one of the directions we got from people is don't stop at workshops. Yeah, workshops have got their uses, but actually as much as you can, try to put people in the shoes of the users. So the idea of shadowing a user, for example, or shadowing a patient around a hospital is one example. Just telling people, let me give you the definition of empathy, I don't know that necessarily helps someone. But if you say, okay, let's shadow this patient, watch their facial expressions, listen to the questions they ask, look for their body language, note the conversations that they have with their family when staff aren't around. So the idea there of actually encountering them with practice is, and you could do that with your engineers too, right? And the last one here is be mindful and explicit about the mindset. So one of our respondents actually uses mindfulness meditation in his workshops. I've been meaning to do that with my MBA students. I'm a little scared to do it, to be very honest. I'm not sure how they would react to it. But why not give this a try, right? In other words, what you're doing in your workshops is creating a consciousness that we are thinking differently here. Not just we're using tools and throwing Post-its on the wall, but there is actually a deep process of thought that is actually happening. And so then recognizing that, having people reflect on that as part of their learning is a big, an important part of this. So that then, is a summary of the work we've been doing. As I said, it's an early stage. We're working towards another book on this. And any input you have, you can grab, Paolo is over here. Paolo, you want to stand up so people can see you? He's the guy with the hat. And yeah. Any input you have will be helpful. Just as a summary, mind the mindset, understand yourself, reach out to others and connect with them. You have the tools already to do that. And it's just a question of actually making that happen. Thank you very much.